Dr. Adrian Vale had always thrived under pressure. He wasn't just good at his job, he was exceptional. His hands were steady, his mind razor-sharp, and his instincts impeccable. In the operating room, he was a god. There was no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. And yet, as he stood over the open skull of his latest patient, something went wrong. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor faltered. The anesthesiologist muttered a curse, adjusting the 4. A nurse called his name. "Dr. Vale." Adrian tried to respond, but the room seemed to tilt. A sharp ringing filled his ears, drowning out the voices around him. His vision blurred, the edges of the world dissolving into darkness. Then, nothing. When he came to, the surgery was over. The patient was stable. His assistant, Dr. Caroline Mendez, stood beside him, eyes filled with concern. "You okay?" she asked. Adrian swallowed hard. His scrubs were damp with sweat. The room was spinning, but no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. He forced a smile. "Yeah, just, long night." Caroline didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "Go get some rest." He should have. Instead, he locked himself in his office, staring at his shaking hands. He didn't remember finishing the surgery. He didn't remember making the final cut, closing the patient's skull, or even stepping away from the table. A blackout. That had never happened before. And it wouldn't be the last. The blackouts became more frequent. At first, they were brief, a missing minute, a conversation he didn't remember starting. Then, they stretched into hours. He'd wake up in his apartment with no memory of driving home. Once, he found himself in his office, staring at a medical chart he didn't recall pulling out. Then came the voices. Soft murmurs at the edge of his hearing, impossible to make out. They followed him through the halls of the hospital, whispering behind closed doors. The first time he saw it, he nearly dropped his scalpel. A shadow stood at the far end of the operating room, just beyond the sterile lights. It had no features, no distinct form, just a shape darker than the surrounding dimness. "Dr. Vale." Caroline's voice jolted him. He blinked. The shadow was gone. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Caroline frowned. "Hear what?" Adrian forced a chuckle. "Nothing. Never mind." But it wasn't nothing. And it wasn't going away. One night, Adrian woke up in his car, parked outside the hospital. The dashboard clock read 3:27 a.m. He had no memory of leaving his apartment. His phone buzzed. A missed call from Caroline. Then another from an unknown number. He hesitated before playing the voicemail. "You need to stop, Dr. Vale. Before it's too late." The voice was distorted, warped as if spoken through broken radio static. A chill ran down his spine. He looked around the parking lot, suddenly aware of how empty it was. The hospital's towering glass facade loomed over him, its windows dark except for the faint glow of emergency lights. Someone was watching him. He could feel it. His fingers clenched around his phone. This was stress. Overwork. Sleep deprivation. That's all. It had to be. But when he lifted his gaze to the rearview mirror, his own reflection was smiling at him. And he wasn't. The next morning, Adrian locked himself in his office and pulled up the hospital records. He needed answers. He combed through patient files, looking for anything, anyone, that could explain what was happening to him. And then he saw it. A name. Daniel Kessler. A patient he had lost a year ago. A difficult aneurysm surgery. Adrian had done everything right, but Kessler had died on the table. His family had accused the hospital of negligence, though no wrongdoing had been found. Still, something about that surgery had never sat right with him. And now Kessler's name kept appearing in his missing hours. Adrian's pulse pounded. He had to find Kessler's widow. She would have answers. She had to. The house was small, tucked away in a quiet suburb outside the city. Adrian knocked, half expecting no one to answer. The woman who opened the door looked nothing like the grieving widow he remembered. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, as if she hadn't slept in months. "Dr. Vale," she said, her voice hoarse. Adrian hesitated. "You remember me?" She gave a humorless smile. "I was wondering when you'd come." His throat tightened. I need to ask you about Daniel. I think something's happening to me." Her expression darkened. "You see him, don't you?" A cold shiver ran down his spine. He almost denied it. Almost. Instead, he whispered, "Yes." She exhaled, shaking her head. "He said he wouldn't rest. He said he'd make you feel what he felt. The helplessness. The fear. He told me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He'd come back." Adrian's hands clenched into fists. "That's impossible." She let out a hollow laugh. "Is it?" Then her gaze met his, and the fear in her eyes made his stomach drop. "Tell me, Dr. Vale, who have you been talking to when no one else is around?" Adrian couldn't answer. Because deep down, he already knew. If it can be continued, do it, otherwise end it. The days blurred together. Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that something was spiraling beyond his control. His hands shook more frequently now, especially when he tried to perform surgeries. It wasn't just the blackouts or the shadow in the operating room. It was the whispers. They had grown louder, more insistent, like fingers scraping against his skull. He avoided Caroline's gaze at work. She had stopped asking him if he was okay. Instead, she seemed to be watching him closely, waiting for something, waiting for him to crack. The reflection in the mirror at the hospital bathroom was starting to look less like him, more like a man who had given up on everything, a man who wasn't sure if he still belonged in this world. He started to piece together the fragments of his memory. Late nights driving without recalling how he'd gotten in his car. Conversations with people that didn't happen. The growing presence of Daniel Kessler's ghost, not just in his thoughts but in his life. He had seen Kessler standing in the halls of the hospital, or maybe it was just his imagination. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more vivid the images became. The name kept repeating in his mind, Daniel Kessler. He knew he had to find out what had happened that night, the night the surgery went wrong. He had to confront the truth, no matter how dark it was. Adrian stood at the edge of the operating room once again, staring at his reflection in the glass wall. His face had grown pale over the past few days, the dark circles under his eyes deepening. He looked like a man on the verge of collapse. And yet, there was something else in his reflection. It wasn't him, it couldn't be. It was someone else, someone with hollow eyes, a face twisted in silent agony. Adrian blinked, and the reflection shifted, vanishing into the shadows behind him. He spun around, but the room was empty. A voice crackled in his ear, distant but clear. "You can't run from what you've done, Dr. Vale." It was Daniel's voice, faint but unmistakable. Adrian's pulse raced as he staggered back, gripping the counter to steady himself. The reflection was still there, but now it was moving, too quickly, too unnaturally. It reached out to him, its fingers grazing the glass. He stepped forward, but before he could touch it, the reflection shattered, the glass splintering into pieces that fell to the floor with a deafening crash. The room fell silent. But the whispers were back. Louder. Clearer. And they were coming from inside his own mind. The hospital was no longer a safe place for Adrian. The longer he stayed, the more the walls seemed to close in on him. He couldn't escape the memories, the whispers, the growing sense that someone, was watching him at all times. He could hear footsteps behind him when he walked the halls, but when he turned, no one was there. He'd find his office door open, even though he was certain he had locked it. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, unable to tell if he was still dreaming. And then, it happened. Adrian found himself standing in front of the surgical suite, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions. How long had he been there? What was he supposed to do? The door to the room creaked open, and there, lying on the table, was Daniel Kessler. His body was cold, lifeless, yet somehow still there. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. The man who was supposed to be dead. "You failed me, Dr. Vale," Kessler's voice echoed, hollow and broken. "Now, you'll see what it's like to be trapped between worlds." Adrian reached out, his hand trembling. But before he could touch the lifeless body, the room seemed to tilt again, like the world was slipping off its axis. The lights flickered, and when they steadied, Kessler's body was gone. And in its place was Adrian. But it wasn't Adrian. It was a twisted version of himself, bloodied, broken, eyes wide with terror. "You're not alone, Dr. Vale," the reflection whispered. "You never were." And then the room went dark. Adrian stumbled through the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. He could hear his own breath, ragged, desperate, echoing around him, but nothing else. No footsteps, no whispers, no voices, just silence. But it wasn't true silence. He could feel something moving in the shadows, something watching him from just beyond his reach. It was the same sensation he had felt for weeks now, a constant pressure against his chest, like something, was just waiting for him to crack. His hands trembled as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the wall. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel the roughness of the bricks beneath his fingertips, a reminder that the world around him was still real, still solid. And then, out of the darkness, came a whisper. "You can't hide from me, Adrian." The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was an undercurrent of malice that sent a shiver down his spine. He tried to ignore it, to keep moving forward, but the words burrowed into his mind, repeating over and over. "You can't hide from me." He stopped in his tracks. The voice wasn't just in his ears, it was inside his head, a constant buzz, like a mosquito that wouldn't leave him alone. His vision blurred, and the ground beneath him seemed to tilt again. He reached out to steady himself, but the walls around him began to warp, twisting and distorting, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The darkness deepened, pulling him in, and then the whispers became a chorus. It was as if every corner of his mind was filled with the voices of the dead, the ones he had failed, the ones he had forgotten, the ones he had let slip away. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth moved, but the world around him swallowed every word. "Dr. Vale." The voice was different now, more familiar. Caroline's voice. He turned around, expecting to see her standing there, but all he saw was the twisted reflection of himself, staring back at him with hollow, empty eyes. "You're too late," the reflection whispered. "You're already gone." Adrian's heart raced as he backed away, his mind scrambling for some way to escape, some way to break free from the grip of the shadows. But the walls kept shifting, bending, like they were alive, like they were closing in on him with every step he took. And then, from the darkness ahead, he saw a figure. It was Daniel Kessler. His body was pale and lifeless, but his eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, locked onto Adrian's with a hunger that made his blood run cold. "You made a mistake," Kessler said, his voice a raspy, broken whisper. "You thought you could outrun your sins. But now they're coming for you." Adrian couldn't move. He was frozen in place, his legs too weak to carry him any farther. Kessler took a slow step forward, his shadow stretching across the walls like a dark omen. "You'll never escape me," Kessler continued, his voice growing louder, more distorted with every word. "And you'll never escape yourself." Adrian's breath hitched. The walls pressed in on him, suffocating him, until he could hardly breathe. The shadow of Kessler loomed over him, and the room seemed to tilt again, as if everything was collapsing into itself. And then everything went dark. When Adrian opened his eyes, he wasn't in the hospital. He wasn't in the shadows or the distorted world he had just been trapped in. He was back in his office. The sterile white walls, the familiar scent of antiseptic, the soft hum of the lights above him. It felt real. Too real. He sat up, his head spinning as he looked around. Was it all a dream? Was it just his mind playing tricks on him? But something felt different. His hands were still shaking, his body drenched in sweat, but there was an eerie stillness to the room. The whispers had stopped. The shadow was gone. And yet, he felt the weight of something pressing down on him, a presence, an awareness, that he couldn't shake. His phone buzzed on the desk in front of him. He reached for it, his fingers trembling as he unlocked the screen. One new message. It was from Caroline. "You're not alone, Adrian. He's still here." The screen went black before he could reply. And then, in the reflection of his office window, he saw it again. The shadow. But this time, it wasn't just behind him. It was standing beside him. And it was smiling.